Well, today is a damn good day. And it is good for many reasons, one of which is that Hoyoverse just announced that they will be rolling out in version 5.2 an absolutely enormous transformative reaction buff to the 4 reactions of Overload, Shatter, Superconduct, and Electro-Charged. Now, it is not finalized as of right now, these are not the official numbers, but as far as I know, the multiplier buffs are going to be 0.5 to 1.5 for Superconduct, which is 200%. For Shatter, it's going from 1.5 multiplier to 3, which is a 100% buff, it's doubled. Electro-Charged damage is going from 1.2 to 2, which is a 66.7% buff. And for Overload, it's going from 2 to 2.7, which should be 37.5. And we are gonna be doing some tier listing. This is a style of video that I have not done for a while on this channel. I've abandoned it in favor of doing lore content, but because this is a special occasion and because this buff genuinely has the potential to alter the game, especially moving forward into the future, and because it affects multiple characters along with many players who play those characters, I decided, you know what, let's make a quick video, skim quickly over how these buffs impact those characters. Okay, without further ado, let us start with Jean. So this buff is going to be a multi-use buff for Jean because Jean can be played in Overload and played in Electro-Charged. Now, in terms of the severity of the buff to Jean herself, unfortunately Jean has been almost swept away by Xianyun. Xianyun invalidated her in most teams because Xianyun does what Jean does but better. In terms of how big and impactful the buff itself is going to be for Jean, I'm thinking about it, and here's the thing. Xianyun is used in hyper carry teams where her carries all build crit. They rarely build elemental mastery unless they're trying to vaporize or melt. And this could revitalize Jean in certain Sunfire setups where, especially in Overload and Electro-Charged. So I will put her in alright. I know there can be an argument made for good buff, but I'm gonna put her in alright for now just to be a little bit reserved. Moving on to Lisa, this is obviously going to be an Electro-Charged buff for Lisa. You could make an argument for Overload, however, Electro-Charged is her... Electro-Charge is going to be the one that will benefit the most. I didn't cover this in the intro, however, although the buffs might seem misleading in terms of the numerical amount, Shatter and Superconduct are still garbage. They're not really, like, going from 0.5 to 1.5 and whatever the other one was, it's not enough to actually make them viable. Like, the buff is massive for Overload, it's massive for Electro-Charged. Unfortunately, it's not that good for Shatter and Superconduct. So when it comes to Lisa in physical teams, this won't be that viable. You're not really building EM on Lisa in physical. Electro-Charged is the only one where I see it actually being reasonably good. And in Overload, you're gonna knock enemies out of her ultimate unless they're really big. You could say multi-use, I'm gonna say Electro-Charged, and in terms of how big the buff, it's a good buff. It's honestly a good buff for Lisa. You can build her EM, she applies a fair bit amount of Electro, yeah, it's gonna be a good buff for Lisa. For Amber, am I missing anything? I think it's not applicable. Yeah, so Amber is going to be not affected. For Noelle, not applicable. For Barbara, it's going to be a good buff in Electro-Charged. Electro-Charged. So Noelle is going to be not affected. Barbara is going to get a... still bad. Yeah, I'm going to put her in still bad. I'm sorry, Barbara. Like, if you actually want to play Barbara, and trust me, I love Barbara. She's one of my favorite characters. If you want to play her, you either play her as a plunge carry with Xianyun and vaporize her plunges, or don't play Barbara. She's not really that good of a support. I suppose you could also make an argument for Moalani, I just realized. But yeah, she's not that good. There are better Hydra supports. For Sucrose, multi-use. However, although I am saying multi-use for Sucrose, I do lean more towards Electro-Charged. But we're gonna put her multi-use because again, Sucrose is an EM base, like she scales with EM. She can be played in Overload in certain team comps. I can't really think of any, so I'm leaning to Electro-Charged. I can't really think of any team comps where... Yeah, you know what? I'm just gonna put her in Electro-Charged. This is an absolutely massive buff for Sucrose. She is in excellent... So here's the thing. Sucrose is not as good as Kazuha or Shilonan in terms of buffing, at least for the most part. I know there are really niche scenarios where she is, but in terms of her on-field damage, she is one of the best 4-star on-field DPS units. So this buff is only going to catapult her even more. Really big buff for Sucrose. And now for our queen, the Prinzessin de Verurtelang, Fischl. Amy is getting Amy needed this buff. Amy wasn't already strong enough. This is going to be an Osvaldo domination, which is really ironic for those of you who have been following the polls on my channel. I recently made a poll for the 4 characters that people would rather remove if they have to pick one character from the 4 best Electro characters in my opinion and remove them. Most people voted out Osvaldo. I believe it was Osvaldo and Clorand, which was really ironic because those are the 2 best Electro units in the game. I don't know why they're voting. I mean, you can leave a comment and explain. But yeah, Fischl is getting an enormous buff in next patch. So not only is she one of the best, if not the best Electro unit, you can make an argument for Clorand, but on top of that, she keeps getting buffed. She keeps getting good weapons, she keeps getting good artifact sets. She got Dendro back in Sumeru, and now she's getting this massive buff. Yeah, Fischl Amy, our queen, our Prinzessin, only takes Ws. For Mona, it's honestly a toss-up. You can use her Mona can be used in many teams, but she's not really that good. Here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna say multi-use because she can be used in many teams. But in terms of how actually big this buff is, I'm gonna say alright, and I'm gonna put her behind Jean. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail because unfortunately today I have some time restraints. I have an appointment later, so I have to get this video out quickly. But if you have anything to add, just leave it down in the comments and people can upvote it if they agree. Okay, next up is Kaya. So this is going to be a unique one. Kaya goes into Superconduct, but he is not affected. I'm not gonna put him in still bad because Kaya was never bad. He's always a decent unit. He doesn't really care about the buff since it really does. Actually, Fischl is better than Sucrose after this. So yeah, he doesn't really care about the buff because Kaya, you play him either as in Melt as a cryo sub DPS, or you play him in Freeze. Does the Superconduct buff benefit him? Yes, it benefits him if you play him in Superconduct teams and physical teams. Does he actually care? No, he does not care. Kaya is basically a cryo DPS. D-Luke, not applicable. Overload, yeah, not applicable. Like, for the most part, not applicable. D-Luke's best team is with Shenyun, and he's going to be vaporizing his plunges. So not applicable, not affected. Razor. I think some of you know there's like a team, I forgot what it's called, is it Thundering Fury? There's like a team that people play with Razor where they proc so many reactions. It's Hyper Bloom, Burgeon, and then there is Overvapes because Overload and Vaporize. Yeah, anyway, whatever. It's a whole bunch of stuff. It's a multi-use thing, and it's going to be a massive buff. It's actually a massive buff to Razor, genuinely. Anyway, after Razor, there is Bennett. Does Bennett give a fuck? In Overload, I suppose, is it actually a big buff? It's alright. It's eh. Like, Bennett is already an absolutely good unit, so doesn't care. Ningguang doesn't give a shit. Either Beidou, Electro-Charged, of course. It's a good buff for Beidou, but unfortunately Beidou is getting power crept next patch. Beidou is getting power crept by, what's his name? Auroran, yeah. I'm gonna say alright. If you know, you know. Keqing, I think many of you are gonna disagree with me in the comments. I'm gonna say not applicable, because, well, let's just put her in Electro-Charged. Do you play her with Chevreuse in Overload? I have no clue. Okay, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna say multi-use, and I'm gonna say not affected. This is my final verdict. If for any Keqing mains or any Keqing enthusiasts, I cannot speak today or this morning, let me know down in the comments if I'm missing anything. I think you can use Keqing in Electro-Charged. You can use her in Overload. Her best team should be Dendro, Aggravate. Not affected for the most part. I don't think it's actually going to matter for her. It will not change her best team. For Xiangling, it's going to be Overload. And Xiangling is she scales with EM, right? Yeah, Xiangling levels up with EM, so it's going to be a good buff. Xiangyun is going to be Shatter. Unfortunately, still bad, which really sucks because I like Chongyun, bro. I like Chongyun. Shatter needs to be reworked. I'm going to talk about it when I get to Ayaka. Xingqiu, my man is getting... It's gonna be Electro-Charged, I mean, that's the only one. And in terms of how big the buff is for Xingqiu, he applies more Hydro than Yelan, he applies more Hydro than Farina, at least at C0. It's gonna be, actually I'm gonna say a good buff. And then we have Chi-Chi. Of course guys, multi-use, of course guys, like massive buff, what are we talking about here? Absolutely insane unit, I'm so glad I have her at C6. For Venti it's going to be multi-use, and for Venti it's also going to be a good buff. Yeah, I'm happy with this. Klee, it's going to be Overload, and it's gonna be alright. I'm not gonna say still bad. Klee is she's an average unit. Tartaglia. This used to be a team taser. So Electro-Charged. Is it actually going to be an absolutely massive buff for Tartaglia? He does have a very high Hydro application. I will say alright. Actually, it's a good buff. It's a good buff. Yeah, it's a good buff for Tartaglia. Although you don't build him EM. It's hard to predict. Because right now, people are doing cheating, but cheating Electro-Charged is difficult. So any theory-crafted cheats, you cannot really trust until we see the full, until the patch comes live and we can test it with our own units. I'm gonna be on the conservative side and put him in alright for now, but I am optimist and I think it's going to be, if you ask me what I think, it should be a good buff in Taser teams, I'm gonna put him in alright. In terms of Taser. Obviously, International doesn't care. For Diona, her C6 gives Elemental Mastery. She can be played. Yeah, she doesn't care. Not applicable. Not applicable. Obviously, if I'm forgetting anything, guys, let me know down in the comments. Zhongli doesn't care. Actually, he doesn't care. But Zhongli's shield shreds... yeah, no, he doesn't care. I'm not even gonna think about it. Xinyan doesn't care. Doesn't care. Albedo doesn't care. Not applicable. Ganyu, again, same thing. Xiao, same thing as Ganyu, he doesn't care. Hu Tao doesn't care. You do not play her in Overload. Her best team is by far going to be Vape. Rosaria, Superconduct. Where is Rosaria? She does not care. Same thing for Rosaria's exact same argument for Kaya. Yanfei, it's going to be Overload. Does Yanfei care? I'ma say no, she doesn't care. Eula, Superconduct, not affected. She, you know what? I'm just gonna put her in still bad. I hecking love doing 40k DPS per rotation. Or sorry, per second. Oh, Kazuha the king. You know how I said Amy is getting an absolutely enormous buff? Kazuha is by far, at least as far as we have gotten in this tier list, I might find a better character. But Kazuha is the biggest benefactor of this buff by a large margin. My guy, so Shilonon came out, people were saying Shilonon power crept Kazuha, whatever. Obviously, she didn't actually power creep him. They are very interchangeable. Kazuha is the grouping, does more damage. Shilonon has no damage, but has a slightly bigger buff, lacks the grouping, and heals. Now, the thing is, the memes were saying that Shilonen came out and power crept Kazuha. Kazuha only got power crept for one patch. That is even if you believe that he was power crept. Kazuha was barely power crept for one patch, and then they buffed him immediately in 5.2. My guy is getting an absolutely ginormous buff with this one. This is so big for him. And now that I think about it, this also buffs his C2, because C2 Kazuha, it gives himself, and correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, it gives himself and it gives an ally 200 elemental mastery. This is so big! Now Kazuha is not only providing an enormous buff to the entire team, or at least to the element he swirls, but he's also going to be doing seriously considerable damage, more so than he already did, and he's gonna have all the benefits that he already provides, such as VV Shred and grouping. Now Ayaka. This buff does not benefit Ayaka whatsoever. She does not care about any of these reactions in her teams. She is played in freeze, and only in freeze unless you're trying to melt with Hu Tao. Same thing, she's not going to be affected. Now, let me talk about Shatter really quickly. I think Hoyoverse need to seriously consider reworking Shatter so that it works on bosses, and here's how they do it. You make it so that freeze works on bosses, but bosses cannot be frozen. They only get the freeze aura, okay? Or the freeze aura above their head. and they instantly trigger Shatter. So the same way you would trigger, for example, Vaporize or Overload on an ICD, you would have a freeze ICD, but instead of freezing the boss every time you refresh it or every time you trigger it, it instantly shatters. This way, not only will freeze get better against bosses, and by proxy characters like Ayaka, characters like Ganyu, and to a lesser extent Risley will get better against bosses. Even, you know what, no, Risley is really good against bosses, forget what I said. Ayaka and Ganyu will be better against bosses, but also, this way they can buff freeze, make it viable against non-freezable enemies, and in the same time make Shatter an actual reaction in the game instead of whatever the hell it is right now. It's so useless at the moment. Let me know, guys, if you agree down in the comments. But the biggest benefactors of this buff so far are Amy, Kazuha, and Sucrose. Like, W's in the chat for these guys. These three are getting freaking catapulted. I am not a believer in Razor, so I'm not gonna really say it's an absolutely massive buff for... It's big for Razor if you're playing him EM, but it's not big enough for me to actually care about Razor himself. So, like, it's big theoretically, but it's not that big in practice. Yoimiya doesn't care, right? I have no clue how people play her. Yeah, Yoimiya doesn't care, she's not affected. Sayu, multi-use, massive buff. Same thing with Razor. It's a massive buff theoretically, it will make Sayu actually viable to play, but I don't think it's a... Like, don't get me wrong, maybe I should have structured this tier list better. This is not going to make Sayu top tier, it's just a massive buff for Sayu herself. Like, she's going from garbage to becoming an actual unit that you can play. Now we have Raiden. This is a multi-use buff for Raiden because Raiden can be played in Overload, can be played in Electro-Charged. Raiden really needed this buff. Raiden is one of those characters who got power crept at the same... Like, she got power crept back in version 4.7 twice in the same patch on the same banner, which is insane. By the way, for those of you wondering, I have C3 Raiden, and there's this new event that came out recently with the 10 million HP boss. I was doing it with my friends. C6 Sethos clears 5 seconds faster than C3 Raiden R1. C6 Sethos R1 Sethos clears 5 seconds faster against the green dragon thing. The whatever his name is, the Mountain King, the one that was with Burkina in Kenichi's quest if you did that. Against that, the 10 million HP version of that boss, Sethos clears 5 seconds faster than C3 R1 Raiden, which is, again, that is insane. So, and obviously Clorand clears 10 to 12 seconds faster. Clorand completely gaps Raiden, the difference is massive. So Raiden really needed this buff, and what's nice about this buff is that it's going to benefit her more than it benefits Sethos and Clorand because of the type of teams people play Raiden in. Now, it will not benefit her in her hyper carry team with Kujo, Sara, with Bennett and Shilonen or Kazuha, but it will be good in the other teams. Raiden really needed this. It's massive, but I'm gonna say good. And don't get me wrong, it's like good, but leaning towards massive. Kujo Sara doesn't give a shit, not affected. Kokomi, Electro-Charged, if you play her in those teams, and it's gonna be alright. Aloy, I'm not even gonna list her, this character is dog shit. Who the fuck? Put her down, bro. No one gives a fuck about Aloy. Toma. Toma is going to be... This is gonna be a overload buff for Toma. It will be pretty damn good. Pretty damn good. By the way, this is not ordered. Ito doesn't care. Goro doesn't care. Shenhe doesn't care. You could argue Shenhe like Superconduct and doesn't care. Like, same argument as Rosaria and Kaya. Doesn't really matter, you're not really playing Shenhe for physical. Yunjin doesn't care. Again, doesn't care. Absolutely massive buff for Yae Miko in both Electro-Charged and Overload. Absolutely massive buff for Ayato, again, multi-use. Electro-Charged. Good buff for Ayato in Electro-Charged. Yae Miko, this is going to be a massive buff for Yae Miko. She scales with Elemental Mastery, remember. You still want to build crit, by the way, obviously, but it is pretty big for Yae. Same argument as Fischl, basically. So I think Fischl benefits more than Yae. Well, I don't think, I know. But same argument for Fischl with Yae, and for Ayato, it's going to be a good buff. Yelan is honestly a really good unit. Like, it will buff her in Electro-Charged. Does she care? I'm gonna say alright. I'm gonna say alright. Now, we've got Cookie, Electro-Charged. I don't think anyone plays Cookie in Overload, right? Yeah, no one does. Electro-Charged, and it's going to be a good buff. Hazel, multi-use. Hazel gives the entire team Elemental Mastery, so it will be it's a massive buff for Hazel. Toghnari doesn't care because Toghnari is Dendro, doesn't get... It's irrelevant to him. Same argument with Kale. Dory, I'm gonna say good buff for Dory, since Electro-Charged. Sino, doesn't care, not affected. Candace, Electro-Charged. I'm gonna say an alright buff. Let's change Still Bad and make it weak buff. Because, like, Still Bad isn't that descriptive. Now I can actually put Candace in weak buff instead of people misinterpreting it or me misrepresenting my position. Nilu doesn't care. You can never play her in anything outside of Bloom. Nahida doesn't care. Layla doesn't care. Cryo, Wanderer, or Scaramouche. Scaramouche doesn't care. He's the exact same as Shao. Faruzan doesn't care. Al-Haytham doesn't care. Not affected. Yaoya, yeah, she doesn't care either. Dia, this is going to be a Overload and Burgeon buff for Dia. Now you can play her EM. Same thing as Toma, basically. And it will be an alright buff for Dia. She's not as good as Toma at doing the triggering, but it will be an alright buff for her. Mika doesn't care. Baiju doesn't care. Actually, Baiju, he increases the... No, he only does for Dendro. Kave, this is a unique one. Kave actually might care in Shatter, because the way you build Kave, you build him with full Elemental Mastery. At least you give him a good amount of Elemental Mastery, and he does buff his own Elemental Mastery. He's an absolutely garbage unit. Kave is so bad. I have him at C6. He's unbelievably bad. Like, one of the worst units in the entire game. Super garbage. This buff, I'm gonna be hopeful, and I'm gonna say it will be an alright buff for Kave. I really hope it actually buffs him meaningfully, because what's gonna happen, now he will be triggering the blooms, but also he can shatter enemies. I really hope the shatter buffs are enough for Kave to work. It's not the same situation with Chongyun, because Chongyun you're gonna build EM in order to shatter, but then you lose all of his cryo damage, so it really does nothing. With Kave, you're already building Elemental Mastery for his Bloom cores. He already buffs his own Elemental Mastery, so yeah, you kind of want this buff for Kave, especially in Shatter teams if you play him in like Freeze Bloom or whatever they call it. Kirara doesn't care. Same thing with Linny, absolutely irrelevant to Linny. You either play him in Monopyro, or you play Linny with the Chevruz, which is Overload, but like you're not building him EM with Chevruz, or you play Linny with my guy, my man, the myth, the legend. I'm gonna put her on multi-use with Farina and in Vape. Alright, is it an alright buff? Yeah, it's an alright. I'm gonna say good buff. Like, Lynette isn't really the greatest at, you know what, I'm gonna say alright. Now that I think about it, you do not really build Lynette in Elemental Mastery. Okay, my man, Freminet. Freminet is going to be a multi-use buff, at least for him, because you have to remember, Freminet will be triggering both Shatter and Superconduct if you play him with Hydro and Electro. So it is a multi-use buff for him technically. Is it a weak buff for Freminet? I would argue it's a weak buff because, like, again, Shatter and Superconduct, the damage they do, the buff is not that good. Like, it's still bad. Unfortunately, it's still a weak buff for Freminet, which is sad. So I think he's the only one in multi-use and weak, right? Yeah, it's kind of sad. Again, Shatter and Freeze, they just need to be adjusted later down the line. Hopefully it happens before Bronya comes out. Nouvellette. It's a Electro-Charged buff if you play him in Electro-Charged. Does he give a shit? Shilonen, Kazuha, nah, Nouvellette doesn't care. Yeah, Nouvellette doesn't care. Riesli doesn't care at all. Where's my man? Riesli. Furina, Electro-Charged. She doesn't actually care. By the way, I should probably explain this. If you're wondering why Farina doesn't care, you usually play her with hyper carries the same way you play Xianyun. Like, she's not buffing. She can, does she benefit in Electro-Charged? Sure. You could say she benefits. Same thing with Candace. Does she actually care? No, she doesn't. Like, you're not playing her in Transformative. This girl, what's her name? Charlotte, she doesn't care at all. Navia, she's Geo, irrelevant to her. Chevreuse, okay. This is interesting. So Chevy is one of my favorite characters in the game. I love this character so much. Chevreuse is going to be an overload buff, obviously, like you play her in overload. And it will genuinely be a good buff for Chevreuse. Is it a massive buff? We're gonna see in the future. This is potentially massive for Chevreuse because of the type of, her buff. She essentially shreds Electro and Pyro resistance, which buffs the damage of Overload since Overload does Pyro damage. This potentially can be massive in the future. It might be massive right now and I might be forgetting something. Let me know if I'm forgetting something. You can genuinely make an argument for this buff to be massive on Chevreuse. I'm gonna say good buff, and it will benefit characters like Arlecchino, which we will get to in a few seconds. Yeah, not too much left. Xianyun does not care whatsoever. You play her exactly with Xiao or like Xiao, if you have her C6. Gaming does not care. You never play him in Overload. You do not want to do that. And you are going to be playing him in Vaporized teams with Furina and with Xianyun. Chiori is really good, but she does not care about this buff. Arlecchino. Now, this does buff Arlecchino with Chevreuse in Overload, which is, I think, either one of, if not Arlecchino's best team. Yeah, this is pretty good. So here's the thing with this buff. Arlecchino, you usually play her in either, like if you have her C6, you're gonna melt her burst in order to one-shot something. But unlike Hu Tao, who you want to play her in Vaporize because that is her best team with Yelan and Farina and Xilonan, Xilonan. Arlecchino can be played in Overload, and Arlecchino's Overload teams, like you're still getting some elemental mastery from your substats. So this is a good buff for Arlecchino. Does it actually make her do more damage than Hu Tao? I am not sure. Like, Arlecchino is barely behind Hu Tao in terms of numerical damage. She's barely behind. They're basically interchangeable in terms of DPS. Obviously, Arlecchino is much easier, like she's so much easier to play than Hu Tao. It's a good buff anyway. It's a good buff, yeah. Like, I don't really like comparing Hu Tao and Arlecchino that much because, again, they're really close. Hu Tao does essentially she does more damage. Electro-Charged for Clorand. Does Clorand care? I'm gonna put her here. I'm gonna say all right. Like, most of Clorand's damage is coming from Clorand herself. So it's not coming from the reactions that she triggers. Or at least, it's not coming from the transformative reactions she triggers. I apologize. Obviously, in Aggravate, it's coming from Aggravate and Quicken. Sethos, literally exact same thing as Clorand. It's gonna be an alright buff. It does not, again, this buff helps Raiden way more than it helps Clorand and Sethos because they already do a lot of damage. And they don't care about the teams that are getting buffed by these reactions. Siege W. Siege W is... It's a weak buff for Siege Queen. Like, there are better Hydras you can play. My little girl... Emily doesn't care. Moalani does not care whatsoever, like at all. It is laughable how much Moalani doesn't care. Same thing with Kachina, same thing with Kinich, same thing with Xilonan. Xilonan already buffed Geo, like Ito and Navia got a massive buff with Xilonan. Chaska, that will be left to be seen. Now, if you want my opinion, Chaska and Aurora, well, they're not getting buffed. Because Chaska and Ororon are coming out with the buffs, so they're not getting buffed. Let's say Chaska and Ororon came out in patch 5.1, what would this do to them? Chaska, it would be an alright buff, like you want to play her Pyro. Ororon, it's an absolutely massive buff for Auroron. Like, my guy is getting, holy! It's so big for him. However, because both characters are not out yet, I will reserve my judgment for them. Alright, so these were the tier lists, every single buff, along with what characters benefit and how much they benefit from each buff. Obviously, if I missed anything, since I'm making this video in a hurry, let me know down in the comments. But for now, thank you all for watching. I've been My Name for now, and I will see you in the next time, hopefully within this week. Give me like 8 to 9 days and I'm gonna have a Star Rail video coming out. Anyway, thank you all for watching, take care, and goodbye for now. Catch you in the next one.